It will come as no surprise that the native language of Belarus is Belarusian, but did you know that this is now a minority language in the country of Belarus? So what's going on? How has it been displaced from the position of being a majority within the country that bears its name? Well, something about that name is that in English there are many different versions, or historically there have been many different versions of the name Belarusian, Belarusian, Byelorussian, and many more. Despite the various English spellings, all of these come back to the fact that Bela means white and Rusan refers to Russian.
Be careful, man! There's a beverage here, huh?
However, an older form of the name wasn't White Russian, but rather White Ruthenian, and this is the historic name that we find given to a subset of the Slavic languages spoken in Eastern Europe at the time, and some people would prefer to call the language something along these lines to get away from historic and indeed present connections to the Russian language, which is a different language. Some of these proposals include Grand Lithuanian, given the place of Belarus and its language in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and many cultural connections with areas of Lithuania. Others would go for a term like Krivian, which refers back to one of the tribes that lived in the area of what is now Belarus, one of these Slavic tribes, and so the name would go back to that. Throughout its history, however, it's also had several derogatory names that basically just mean simple or basic language, which seems to be the complete opposite to a title like Grand Lithuanian. But perhaps my favourite name that has been suggested for the Belarusian language is Simple Black Ruthenian.
Undoubtedly black, without question.
This is quite fun because it basically flips the whole White Russian or White Ruthenian thing on its head and instead calls it Black Ruthenian. I don't know, I just thought it was fun. But for now, we will stick with the term Ruthenian when discussing this language in the past, as this was before a Belarus existed, a White Russia. This Ruthenian language is found spoken in parts of what is now Belarus and also neighbouring countries today throughout the Middle Ages. This territory was fought over by speakers of Polish and by speakers of Russian, and for a long time throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period, the territory of what is today Belarus, as well as a large part of the Baltic countries, belonged to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. A quick note on the Slavic languages in this area: there are several main branches of the Slavic languages, including East Slavic. And Ruthenian is noticed to be one of these East Slavic languages, coming from a common ancestor that it shares with the languages of Ukrainian and Russian, as well as several others today. However, there are more Slavic language branches, and as you have an East, there is also a West Slavic branch. Today, these are the majority languages of Polish, Czech and Slovak, as well as several minority languages, for instance Sorbian in Germany and Kashubian spoken in Poland. However, because of history and the influence and spread of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Polish language, so a West Slavic language, had rather a lot of influence on the forms in the past that would become Ukrainian and Belarusian, so this language that we would call Ruthenian in the past. A big shout out to the groundskeeper of St. Catherine's College, who was a Ruthenian speaker and told me about it a few years ago. Of course, very sadly for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, towards the end of the 18th century, it would be partitioned away and out of existence. This meant that now the territory which would become Belarus, and indeed large parts of Ukraine, came to be part of the Russian Empire. However, the linguistic situation didn't get any simpler, as while the peasantry continued speaking Ruthenian, both the higher and the lower nobility at this point were speaking Polish as their main language. But now the language of government and the language of control was the Russian language of the Russian Empire. Indeed, Polish seems to have maintained the status of being the highest status language in these areas because the nobility spoke Polish.
Name und Vorname?
Grzegorz Brzęczysztykiewicz. Brzęczysztykiewicz. Grzegorz.
And interestingly enough, while Poland disappeared before 1800, many of the most famous Polish authors like Władysław Sirokomla were actually born in what today is no longer Poland. Władysław Sirokomla is particularly interesting because while he wrote in Polish, he self-identified as a Lithuanian and actually was embarrassed that he couldn't speak the Lithuanian language, but he was born in what is today Belarus. So talk about an identity crisis. In the 19th century, however, Belarusian itself, as it would soon become called instead of Ruthenian, started to experience a wave of appreciation and interest, and this came off the back of course, Romantic nationalism. And because I've mentioned Romantic nationalism, as I do in all my videos, I will now show this lovely painting of the Norwegian countryside, as the ideals of Romantic nationalism entailed that the authentic Volksgeist, the spirit of the people, wasn't to be found among the metropolitan elite of the city, but rather the rustic, the rural country folk out in the countryside speaking their dialects, the purest form of the language, the purest form of the culture as it was seen in those innocent days of the mid-19th century. However, things wouldn't remain innocent for long, as in 1863, those in favour of recreating a Polish state, a Polish-Lithuanian state, rose up in rebellion against the Russians, and in order to get the peasantry on side, they started to promote the use of Ruthenian in order to have that wider base of support, as well as the higher Polish-speaking aristocracy. But unfortunately for them, they were defeated by Russian forces.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
And the following crackdown left Ruthenian in the lurch. But starting in the 1870s, what was now becoming known as Belarusian started to be published more frequently, as it had been under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and we started to see the first dictionaries appearing in 1870. Another interesting character to mention is Franciszek Bohusiewicz. This man, as you can see from the various ways in which his name is spelled, was also of a slightly higher class and certainly knew how to write in Polish. He had actually joined the 1863 uprising against the Russians, which had been crushed. He was born in Belarus. He then moved to Ukraine, where he published in Polish. Afterwards, he moved to Lithuania, where he would start writing in his mother tongue, which was Belarusian. Now, interestingly, while he wrote in Belarusian, he was not allowed to publish in Belarusian, at least not within the Russian Empire, as this had been banned. So he only published in Polish within the Russian Empire, but outside of the Russian Empire, so publishing in Kraków, which is today part of Poland, but then part of the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was able to publish his books there, this ban only being lifted in 1904. He's most famous for saying, "Do not forsake our language lest it dies," and it's thanks to his work that more activism was done and more people became interested in writing the language as poets and as literary figures. In the 1890s, this started to come to a head, with more Belarusian speakers and writers emerging in academic circles as well, which challenged the stereotype that this was just the old Ruthenian language of peasants and the rural folk. The 1897 Imperial Russian census showed that there were some 6 million people within the empire who identified themselves to be Belarusians, or White Russians as it was phrased in the census there. Interestingly, of these speakers, only around a tenth of the inhabitants of those living in the cities in what is today Belarus said that they could speak Belarusian. Instead, by far the majority in the city spoke either Polish or increasingly Russian, as well as a large Jewish minority who would speak Yiddish as well as these languages. However, in the countrysides, Belarusian was still the dominant language there. In 1905, following revolution in Russia and the democratization of the Tsarist government, many of the peasant class in Belarus also became interested and followed ideas of socialism. In 1918, it was a democratic government that took power in Belarus following the collapse of the Russian Empire.
I love democracy. I love the Republic.
And as such, they made Belarusian the only official language of the state. However, they would soon be ousted by the Soviets, of course very powerful in Russia, and the Belarusian Soviet Republic would become part of the USSR. Now in this state, Belarusian also became an official language, but it was co-official together with Russian, Yiddish and Polish, which were spoken by large groups in the country at the time. Belarusian was taught in schools to a limited degree, but it wasn't only in Belarus that there were Belarusian speakers, as also emerging from the chaos of the Eastern Front in the First World War was the reunited Poland. And so part of the Belarusian speaking area was now ruled over by the Poles. However, in Poland, the only language of instruction allowed in schools was Polish, and so those Belarusian speakers in Poland were often discriminated against for their language and weren't allowed to use their language in education or in publishing. After some time, these rules were lightened a little in Poland. However, there was a distinction forming between the type of Belarusian grammar being used in Poland and that being used in the Soviet Republic of Belarus, because in the Soviet Republic several language reforms had been pushed through, these reforms not being recognized a lot of the time by the anti-socialist Belarusians living over in the Polish part of Belarus, and so two different types of the Belarusian language started to emerge and split. This wouldn't be the first time that grammar would be politicized. In 1941, things changed again, with the German invasion of the Soviet Union and their occupation of the Soviet Republic of Belarus. They promoted the use of the Belarusian language instead of Russian, seeing it as a way to heighten national sentiment and to bring the Belarusians away from the Russians, away from the Soviets who had tried to create them as one people. One way that the German authorities did this was to build thousands of Belarusian-speaking schools to teach in the language and to promote the use not of the Cyrillic alphabet that is shared with Russian and Ukrainian and several other Slavic languages, but instead to use the Latin alphabet like Polish, Czech and Slovak did, but of course which German shared, hence why they wanted them to use this instead. This wouldn't be the first time that this is done either. They also went with, ironically enough, the Polish variant of the Belarusian grammar, at least that which was stuck to by Belarusian speakers living on the other side of that border, which had become Soviet in 1939. It's very complicated. Then in 1944, everything changed once again. Interestingly, partisans that were under the command of Soviet forces in Belarus attacked these Belarusian-speaking schools because the Soviets were worried of this driving a wedge between them and the Belarusian people if they started to speak Belarusian again. When the Soviets took over Belarus and invaded Germany, a period followed known as Russification. In the 1950s and 1960s particularly, the idea was that all of these disparate peoples, many of whom had actually thrown in their lot with the Germans during the war, should become one people, and that involved speaking one language, which inevitably was Russian. This led to a serious decline in the state of the Belarusian language, which had enjoyed fairly good rights and status beforehand. The number of articles and publications declined severely, as did the number of schools that taught in the language, and indeed the state in the cities remained that Belarusian had a very weak hold there, while in the countryside it clung on. The state-sponsored repression of the Belarusian language started to soften in the 1980s in the period of perestroika, and by the time of Belarusian independence in 1991, a year earlier in 1990, a law on language had been passed in the Soviet Union that allowed each republic to have their own separate mother language alongside Russian as an official language. Now in 1994, this new democratic Belarusian state made Belarusian the sole official language once again, in an effort to revive all the damage done by this period of Russification. And things were really going in the right way. In the capital Minsk, which for a very long time had been a bastion of Russian speakers, now over half of the schools teaching primary education were teaching in the Belarusian language, which was a first. Things were really improving, more magazines were being printed in the language, and there were grand plans for ways to revitalize it further. And that was when In 1994, we must introduce a new character to the story.
Unscrupulous character. Goes by the name of...
Alexander Lukashenko.
Haven't heard that name in a while. Really? It was a pseudonym sometimes used by a rival of mine. A total prat.
Alexander Lukashenko, or Alexander Lukashenka. Interestingly enough, one of the distinctions between Belarusian orthography and Russian orthography is that the sound, the unaccented R, which is pronounced as A, so Lukashenka, is written that way in Belarusian. So I'll use the Belarusian informed style Lukashenka for this video. This was a candidate who rose and was elected to president in 1994 on a platform saying, "I will not become a dictator." By 1995, he had given himself powers to dismiss parliament and powers to stay in office until at least 2001. He has been in power ever since. Viewers at home can make of this what they will. However, it's fair to say that he reinstated many of the policies that made the Soviet Belarusian Republic a repressive
I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
And he also appears to have inherited several of those Russified attitudes towards Belarusian language and its speakers. I quote, "People who speak Belarusian cannot do anything, because nothing great can be expressed in Belarusian. The Belarusian language is a poor language. There are only two great languages in the world, Russian and English." It's fair to say he had a disastrous impact on the efforts to revitalize the language. While in 1994, before he took power, 58.6% of primary education schools in Minsk were teaching in Belarusian. In 1998, that was 4.8%. And in every other major city, there were no schools teaching in the language, being relegated once again to the countryside. As well as this, publications dwindled in the language, and around 95% of government business is conducted in Russian rather than Belarusian. Soon afterwards, Russian was also made a co-official language alongside Belarusian, which has allowed it to surpass Belarusian in pretty much every official capacity and indeed social capacity, given that it is a language with a higher status for many in the country, and so Belarusian has continued to dwindle in its speakers and the areas where it is spoken, being once again only 13% of schools in the country teach Belarusian, and there are no universities that teach the language or have any kind of course or education in the language. However, from the 2010s onwards, a new young generation started to want to try and revive the language once again, with various institutions pushing for more linguistic rights and an end to discrimination against speakers by the government. These actions included a Latin language metro map of places in the capital, as well as simply information available in the Belarusian language at cultural events and festivals. It also had various courses teaching the language in both Belarus as well as for the expat community abroad. It even seemed that Lukashenka was starting to take notice, as in 2014 he said that losing the Belarusian language would mean losing part of the Belarusian identity. In 2019, around 60% of respondents to a poll felt that the Belarusian language was important to the Belarusian identity, even though only around 25% said they used it on a daily basis. However, in 2022, protests against Lukashenka's governments and demands for democratic reform were a catalyst for the language situation to change once again, as it was now viewed that many Belarusian speakers were in fact those against the Lukashenka government, which, to be honest, is unsurprising given his track record about how he's handled the language. Indeed, at many of these protests, Belarusian featured prominently, given that rightly Lukashenka is being seen as in the pocket of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And once again, it's interesting to see that grammar seems to play a role in this, as there seems to be a divide between the official Belarusian grammar that was approved and changed by the Soviets and that which was the pre-reform Belarusian grammar, which seems to have stuck to more native forms rather than coming with Russian-like forms. It's a big question what the situation with Belarusian will be like in the future, and it seems unlikely that with Lukashenka in power, any real positive change from a government level will be possible. However, if at some point Lukashenka is ousted and the pro-democratic voices get a larger say, it seems that we would have more chances for Belarusian to be revived properly, given that that is exactly what they wanted to do before 1994. It's also interesting that this might have a physical impact on the language too, given that the current Russian-based orthography is being challenged by several activists who want a more native-based orthography that incorporates more of the actual sounds of the Belarusian language into the writing system, rather than that one based on Russian. Even more drastic would be a Romanization to use the Latin alphabet instead of Cyrillic. This would of course bring its practice much closer to neighboring languages like Polish, like Czech and Slovak, and indeed make it more legible for people in the European Union. But of course, this is all still very far into the future. And it doesn't seem likely that this is a major priority for many Belarusians today. It's simply something interesting that in the future may become more prominent, as in recent years more writing in the Latin alphabet in Belarusian has been seen, particularly by pro-democracy advocates who wish to communicate further with the international community. So let me know in the comments below, what do you think about the Belarusian language? Personally, I think it's a real shame that this language, which is the native language unique to Belarus, or at least to a large part of Belarus, that it is now becoming a minority language at the changes that have been implemented by Lukashenka and by centuries of Russian speakers believing that they are better and have a better language, things that are even reflected in the speech by the president. But let me know, what do you think is necessary for things to change for the Belarusian language for the better? Does it involve language being changed from the top, or will perhaps the language kind of form its own bastion of resistance against the dictatorial regime of President Lukashenka? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. I have been Hilbert, and this was The History. Zakuj I do pobaczenia.